This video contains spoilers of most major story beats in the game, so if you don't want to get spoiled, stop watching. The Last of Us Part 2 is a disappointing sequel to one of the best games of the last 10 years. A sequel which seems to forget the nuance, the finesse, and the balance that the first game had with its superb blend of storytelling and gameplay. This is a game that fundamentally confuses depth for excess. A game that features some of the dumbest and most absurd gameplay and story sequences that I have ever seen in a contrived effort to relay a story through the use of gameplay. There is an adolescent understanding of what a profound story is, with every point, every concept and idea being hammered repeatedly to the point of exhaustion. The astonishing graphics and decent combat mechanics, which would be fine if not amazing for a 15-hour game like the first one, struggle to keep things interesting over this game's mediocre story and unnecessary length. In this video, I will attempt to summarize all the reasons why I think that The Last of Us Part 2 fails where the first game succeeded, so let's start from the top. The story starts with Ellie and Joel living in Jackson, a secure town which allows them to lead a pretty normal life. Ellie and Joel are kind of estranged from one another due to what is then revealed to be Ellie's knowledge of what Joel did in the first game. You soon get introduced to Abby, who is this tough-looking girl that ends up killing Joel in front of Ellie because she's the daughter of the doctor that was going to operate on Ellie and develop a vaccine in the first game. Abby spares both Ellie and Tommy, who is Joel's brother, in a move that makes very little sense given that they don't even find out what the relationship is to Joel, and every one of their friends realizes that it is a stupid thing to do. Ellie is set in a path of revenge to find and kill Abby. Dina, her girlfriend, decides to join her. Tommy, who previously tried to convince Ellie that it's not worth the risk, sets off on his own, though he pretty much knew Ellie would do the same. Given how dangerous the world is, this makes absolutely no sense. Throughout the game, you narrowly escape death multiple times, which makes the whole concept of traveling alone inherently unbelievable and contradictory to pretty much everything that you experience in your playthrough. So, you play as Ellie, trying to track down and kill Abby. This is roughly the first 10 to 12 hours of the game. Throughout this fairly straightforward story, there are a number of detours. Going through the town is an ordeal in and of itself, and you need to visit several different locations before finally reaching your goal. The story tries to make you care for Dina and Jesse, but ultimately fails because there is just not a lot of character development going on in those first 10 hours, and you just don't spend that much time with them. Both Jesse and Dina are tagging along because they don't want you to go through this on your own, but then again, that's precisely what they let you do twice. And not just go gather supplies nearby or something, but go further beyond than you have with them entirely on your own. It doesn't make a lot of sense, but then again, not much of what happens in the game does. The characters aren't driving the story forward, but rather the other way around. Most characters don't act the way that you expect them to because they need to act out of character in order for specific story beats to occur. During the few times you're actually playing with Dina or Jesse, the banter between them is minimal and uninteresting, and whereas in the first game it helped develop Joel and Ellie's relationship through the gameplay sequences, there's barely any of that here. There's a love triangle thing going on with Dina being pregnant with Jesse's son, which she reveals to Ellie after Ellie reveals her immunity to the infection, and then they never talk about it ever again, which of course is precisely the opposite of how real people would behave. Ellie's immunity is the single most mind-blowing piece of information that a human could receive in this world, but Dina seems to not care too much about it. What made Joel and Ellie's relationship interesting in the first game was how different they were from one another. Ellie was full of energy and optimism, cracking jokes and being careless, while Joel was a man destroyed by grief that no longer cared for anything and slowly starts caring about Ellie and tries to teach her how to survive. Jesse and Dina feel tacked on, like extras thrust into a supporting role that has them more as a backdrop than anything else. Nothing that Ellie does would have been different had Dina or Jesse not been there, or if there were different characters. The story would have been pretty much the same. Gameplay through these sections is largely similar to the first game. There are some new additions like a few new enemy types such as dogs and the ability to go prone and hide yourself in tall grass. There is no real variation between the combat encounters that you get 5 hours into the game and the ones that you get 20 hours in, because most enemy types and behaviors are introduced early on. There's an upgrade system for your weapons and your skills, like being able to craft more items or increasing a gun's fire rate and damage, but this doesn't add any real variety to the core gameplay. It just makes things slightly easier. However, it does have the unintended consequence of making you scour every single inch of every level in search of weapon parts or pills, even though you might have full ammo and resources otherwise. At least I did while playing in moderate difficulty. Now combine this with the fact that the levels are much bigger and detailed than in the first game, and you will spend a lot of time running against walls and shelves, hitting triangle to make sure you don't miss anything. It would be nice if your companions also looked around for resources and gave them to you when needed or something. It would have streamlined the gameplay and made them more believable. Instead, they just stand around waiting for you to carry on. This Ellie arc finally reaches its climax when Abby breaks into the theater that she is using as a base of operations with Jesse, Tommy, and Dina. Jesse is killed, and as Abby gets ready to kill Ellie, the game cuts to you playing as her. The next 8 to 10 hours of playtime intentionally mirror Ellie's experience in the most ham-fisted way possible. There's the part where you're running through your town/base, just like you did with Ellie. You visit an aquarium with your boyfriend Owen, just like Ellie visits a science museum with Joel. Abby befriends two sisters and decides to risk her own life to save them, while Ellie decided not to go help Tommy and keep searching for Abby instead. Bad Ellie. Hell, Abby even gets her own version of a love triangle involving a pregnant woman. Everything about this idea of having you play as the quote-unquote villain to see her side of the story is overplayed and overdone. Instead of having a tight 3 or 4 hours of gameplay to convey the very obvious idea that Abby isn't so bad and that she had her reasons for doing what she did and that Ellie's path of revenge will produce more harm than good, it goes on for 10 unnecessary hours. Some people hated the fact that you have to play as Abby because they disliked the character, but I didn't mind that as much as I did how excessive all of this is. It just never seems to end. The two Scars, Lev and Yara, are pretty muted and uninteresting characters. The whole side plot ends with Abby betraying and murdering her former allies to save Lev, who she just met 2 days ago. Lev, by the way, is trans and tries to convince her mother to run away from the cult like she did, but given that she's a religious fanatic, let's just say the conclusion to that story isn't very surprising. Throughout this new parallel arc, you once again have to upgrade your skills and your weapons, just like you did with Ellie, which further drives home the similarities and sameness of the experience. Throughout both playthroughs, everything seems to go as bad as humanly possible all the time. Every destination is further away than you thought. Every door is jammed, everything needs a detour, every bridge and crawl space crumbles beneath you, every building is either full of infested or human patrols. The combat isn't bad, but when there's so much of it and it's all pretty much the same because the only actual variation comes from the level design, it gets really tiresome. Even 30 minutes away from the end of the game, you are still getting the same combat encounters that you got 20 hours ago, and it just gets boring. It is completely unrelenting and it serves absolutely no purpose. Abby's arc ends with the scene at the theater, ready to fight Ellie. What follows is one of the dumbest and most ill-conceived gameplay sections that I've ever played in any game. You have to fight Ellie, which is obviously something you don't want to do, but remember, that is the whole point of this. This fight starts and stops several times with Ellie almost shooting you point blank to then seemingly forget where you are because you ducked behind a piece of cover. It is literally the same behavior dogs have to the most basic tricks. How this section managed to get into the game when a simple cutscene would have sufficed is completely beyond me. The whole thing ends with Abby beating the shit out of Ellie and Dina until Lev makes her come to her senses and leave you alone, and so the story seemingly comes to an end. But this is the point where the game takes a nosedive into the deep waters of complete idiocy. Ellie is now living in a farm with Dina and her adoptive son. They have a beautiful house with plenty of stuff to keep themselves occupied and both seem extremely happy. But no, Ellie suffers from PTSD from Joel's death and her unresolved vengeance. Fortunately, Tommy shows up and lets her know that he's tracked down Abby once again. This time, she's in Santa Barbara. Ellie wants nothing to do with it for about 12 hours, but then decides to leave her new family and home to do what needs to be done on her own. We get some more Abby and Ellie gameplay as Abby is captured by some sort of slavers and Ellie ends up going commando on the slaver base, freeing the prisoners and ultimately freeing Abby, only to seemingly give up on her revenge. But no, she changes her mind once again and we get a final showdown at the beach with the two women beating the crap out of each other for several minutes, even though Abby is malnourished and has been hanging on a tree long enough for her arms to have this mold thing, and Ellie could just barely walk a few minutes earlier. The fight is basically a quick-time event because the dodge mechanic that they implemented reduces hand-to-hand combat to waiting for an enemy to attack, dodging, and then counter-attacking. Enemies will try to hit you at most 3 times in a row, and that is pretty much all there is to it. Once this whole mess is over, Ellie is about to drown Abby, but has yet another change of heart and lets her go. The game ends with Ellie returning to the farm and finding Dina gone. She tries to play the guitar but can't because she lost 2 fingers while fighting Abby. Her quest for vengeance has cost her everything. By the end of the game, she's lost her friends and her family, and both her mind and body are essentially broken. Throughout her story, Ellie changes her mind on revenge around 6 times, and her behavior is often out of character. She's shaken by the sight of men tortured by Tommy, even though you do this on a regular basis. She makes mistakes when handling hostages, even though she obviously knows better, but the lack of creativity in storytelling and writing require her to be careless. She abandons her friends and makes every wrong decision. In contrast, Abby is shown as more compassionate and level-headed, but playing from her perspective feels contrived and engineered instead of being clever and organic. The idea of mirroring Ellie's story is not inherently bad, but it is poorly executed. There is no subtlety or cleverness, and the intent is so obvious they might as well write it on the screen. There's also a lack of consistency to both characters' actions and motivations. We get to see both Ellie and Abby decide not to kill someone mere minutes before or after literally gutting and blowing people up, which makes absolutely no sense. This is just one of the flaws of the story they are trying to tell. The Last of Us 2 ultimately fails because of a complete lack of editing. If the game were 10 hours shorter, that is, reducing both Ellie's and Abby's gameplay by around half, nothing would have been lost. It wouldn't have been as good as the first game because the story and characters just aren't very good, but at least it would have been a better experience overall. The game gets lost in a self-indulgent loop, serving up more brutality, more stress, more desperation, more everything. By the end of the game, you feel as spent as Ellie or Abby, ready to get it over with, but not because of some triumph of storytelling, but rather an excess of uninteresting characters, side plots, repetitive gameplay and exploration that just aren't enough to keep the game compelling, even when taking into account the technical prowess shown and the superb execution. It is unfortunate that criticism of this game has, at least for the time being, devolved into the criticism of the disrespect shown for the characters of the first game or of the gender politics which are part of it. Both of which are shallow discussions that have nothing to do with the actual problems that the game has. I think this is a deeply flawed game that wasn't worth the 7-year wait, and I wish instead of making a sequel they had made an entirely new story with new characters in the same world. As it stands, I would give this a solid 6 out of 10 or maybe even a 7 considering the insane production value, but I would not recommend you play this unless you really like the combat system to the point you want to go through 20 hours of it. Alright guys, that will be all for now. Please leave your comment down below and let me know what you thought about the game. This is bound to be a polarizing experience for most players, so please be respectful of other people's opinion. If you like this video, please check out the other videos on the channel and subscribe if you enjoy them. Thanks for watching, and I hope I will catch you in the next one.